do things differently there.
The Boyd County Courthouse, a landmark for many years to the people of Catlettsburg and Boyd County. And you know, nearly 2 centuries ago, things in Boyd County were a lot different than the way they are today.
How different it seems to us now with our 20th century perspective to flash back almost 2 centuries ago and imagine a time before there was a Boyd County, a Catlettsburg, or an Ashland. How different it seems to imagine a time before telephones, before electricity, before steamboats, automobiles, or railroads. How different it seems to imagine a time when men and women of indomitable spirit and genuine courage sailed down the Ohio River in flatboats or traveled overland in ox-drawn wagons to come to eastern Kentucky and forge a home out of the wilderness. It's easy to see what attracted the early settlers to the hills of eastern Kentucky. In the late 18th century, there was an untouched beauty to the land. There were rugged mountain ranges, dense forests, fertile farmlands, abundant natural resources, and the powerful Ohio River. The river brought pioneers by the boatload to this area, as well as trappers and traders who dealt in luxuries like sugar, salt, coffee, and tea. Circuit riders brought the gospel. Horseback riders brought the mail. And the first families of the area, the Catletts and the Pogues, brought the dream. They blazed a path that others would follow of finding a new frontier home on the banks of the Ohio. Homes were built, crops were planted, trails were opened, mills, businesses, churches, and schools were started. The new river communities began to take shape. After the Indian threat subsided, more pioneers traveled to places that now are called Catlettsburg and Pogue Settlement to stake their claim on a new life in a new land. The work was hard, but the first settlers soon realized that this area's potential was unlimited. Catlettsburg's strategic location at the juncture of the Ohio and Big Sandy rivers made this gate city port a thriving trading and manufacturing city long before Ashland was on the map. The beautiful oak, pine, poplar, cherry, and walnut forests of the Big Sandy Valley proved to be Catlettsburg's greatest economic assets. At one time, the Gate City was reputed to be one of the largest round timber markets in the world. Massive rafts of logs picked up from ports up and down the Big Sandy would stretch almost all the way across the width of the Ohio. Regularly, they would set sail, floating idly down the river to eager buyers in Louisville or Cincinnati. Down the road a ways in Pogue Settlement, a Greenup County farmer named Richard Deering made a discovery that helped to realize that area's business and industrial potential. That discovery was iron ore. In the early 1800s, Deering constructed a small, crude furnace on his farm, and he smelted the first iron in the region. This iron filled molds, hammers, skillets, pots, and other necessary homestead items. Thanks to Deering's ingenuity, his neighbors would no longer have to wait on expensive shipments from Virginia and Maryland furnaces to arrive. They could purchase the iron utensils they needed locally. Eventually, though, demand exceeded supply. So Deering struck a partnership with other local business people to create the Argolite furnace, the first charcoal iron furnace in the area.
These huge old stones, they're all that remain really of the old Bellefonte furnace. And once the air in eastern Kentucky was thick with the charcoal smoke from the Bellefonte, the Amanda, the Buena Vista, the Clinton, and the Princess furnaces.
They were close to the iron ore and rocks, which in clay. One of the early ones was the Clinton furnace, which is out, it was crossed up in the holler from where the Rose Hill Baptist Church is. And then they owned Amanda furnace, which was between here and Russell. And they helped build the Bellefonte furnace, which is part of it still standing out in Bellefonte. First big business that came into Ashland was the Ashland Coal and Iron Manufacturing Company. AC&I, we knew it. They built a railroad between Ashland and Rush and to haul coal back in here to Ashland for the boat and also the furnaces. In 1867, they built the Ashland furnace, which was down on 6th in the riverfront. It was considered the largest furnace in the world in the day it was built. And that one was in one end of town. And in 1872, they built the Norton Iron Works. It had a very large furnace too, and it was on 22nd in the riverfront. Them was the three largest industries. It was in the early days of Ashland.
When the local supply of iron ore and timber began to diminish, the old furnaces made way for those that used coke and coal for fuel. And because of them, Ashland in subsequent decades would come to be known as the city where coal meets iron. But at that time, northeastern Kentucky and southern Ohio gained notoriety as the nation's leading iron producers west of the Alleghenies. Pig iron proved to be big business indeed in Pogue settlement, which was still a part of Greenup County. As the furnaces multiplied, river traffic increased, moving eastern Kentucky iron down Ohio to other lucrative markets. More and more settlers came to the furnace communities in search of work. More homes were built to house the workers and their families. More retail businesses opened to supply their material need. Amid such prosperity, both Catlettsburg and Pogue settlement had shrewd leaders who were planning for the future in many ways. In both communities, local citizens saw education as another means of providing a more promising tomorrow for their children and for the area. Some of the wealthier frontier families had solved the education problem by sending their children to private schools back east. Some hired private tutors. Some did nothing, because for many local residents, education was a luxury, a low priority when compared with simple survival. But other citizens had an educational vision that, well, it matched the area's industrial ambitions. They knew that education was essential if communities were to grow and prosper. So in each town, they worked together to expand educational opportunities. With regard to education, when John G. Crabb became superintendent of Ashland schools in 1893, he brought with him a new passion for institutional reform. His Catlettsburg counterpart, J.B. Leach, shared this passion for education. Both men helped to revitalize this area's school systems. Catlettsburg city fathers like to describe their town at the turn of the century as a receiving depot for the products of the fertile valley of the Big Sandy, unequaled for its mineral wealth. And they boasted about the town's 3 newspapers, 4 churches, 4 schools, 5 hotels, a courthouse, post office, a bank, a brewery, a tannery, flouring mill, sawmills, an iron foundry, machine shop, tin shop, saddle shop, jewelers, drugstore, bookstore, debating society, and a billiard hall. Not to be outdone, the Ashland Improvement Company was formed to further the economic changes that had already occurred and to Ashland and the industry, words that had in many people's minds become synonymous. The company described the Ashland of the late 19th century in a pamphlet designed to entice new businesses. Cited as positive factors for locating there were railroad and river transportation, cheap fuel, valuable minerals, timber, beautiful home sites, and plenty of churches and schools. The health of Ashland has always been excellent, said the pamphlet, and the beautiful situation of the town makes it a most delightful place of residence. The town is built roomily over considerable territory, but is a very charming place in appearance, with well-graded streets 100 feet in width, shaded by trees adorned by reserved grass plots that give the resident streets the appearance of boulevards. The article continued, many of the residences are very handsome and costly, while the homes of the poorer class are comfortable, neat, and what is better, 7/10 of the working men of our town own the houses in which they live, and thus form the bone and sinew of a strongly and patriotic population. The community is orderly and law-abiding, the article continued, and has had less trouble from strikes and fewer instances of bloodshed and disorder than almost any manufacturing town that might be named. So there. One famous incident of bloodshed and disorder, however, was what has come to be known as the Ashland tragedy.
On December the 24th, 1881, Miss Gibbons, who was the mother of Fanny and Bobby Gibbons, went across the street and got a little girl by the name of Emma Carrico to stay all night with her two children while she was gone to Arden to visit one of the other daughters. Along about midnight, three men broke into the home, proceeded to rape the two children, two girls, and they killed all three of them, the boy too. And they set the house on fire to try to burn the evidence. And the children was dragged out of the house before they burned up by Mr. Faulkner, who lived across the street. Later on, one of the men confessed to the murder, implicating two other men. He was tried at Catlettsburg and sentenced life in prison because he turned state evidence against the other two. His name was George Ellis. Well, the two implicated was Ellis Craft and William Neal. Later on in June 2nd, 1882, 12 men marched up Front Street, 12 masked men marched up Front Street, proceeded to the old Chatteroy roundhouse, and had a colored man by the name of Stokes to fire the engine up and take him to Catlettsburg to proceed to get this man out of jail. Brought him back down to Ashland at 28th and Mill Street and hung him on a sycamore tree. And he wasn't cut down from that sycamore tree till late in the next afternoon. The other two men 2 years later was tried at Grayson, and they were also hung over the crime, which was called the Ashland tragedy.
Local newspapers had a field day with the story. The turn of the century brought the area another new one, the Ashland Daily Independent. Boyd Countyans looking for something to do on a lazy summer day could no doubt find in their local papers stories about upcoming events that, well, might include a Chautauqua in Central Park, day of racing at Catlettsburg's racetrack, or streetcar excursions to Cliffside Park. They could also find out who was headlining the local vaudeville theaters or what silent movies were playing at a local Nickelodeon. In the early 20th century, a wide variety of entertainment opportunities existed.
Well, when I was growing up, we had the Capitol, the Grand, the Modern, the Arizona, and Columbia theaters in Ashland, downtown Ashland. And the Lyric was up on 29th and Winchester. But before that, we had an opera house, which was on 17th and Greenup. It burned in 1931, and it had a very large auditorium, which was large for the size of Ashland, which seated better than 900 people. And they were stage plays, came through here and sometimes show for a week at the Opera House. And then Capitol was built. Capitol Theater was considered the best theater in Ashland until the Paramount was built. Capitol was built as Arcadia in 1921, opened Christmas Eve, 1921. Grand opened in 1915. It's where Revco is today. Modern's been torn down for several years, so is the Edizonia. The Columbia, it's torn down too. It's where Henry House's plumbing company is today. It was strictly a vaudeville show, Columbia Theater was. In the early days, they had piano players at all of them. Of course, when the Capitol opened as the Arcadia, it had an orchestra. Quite a few big bands played around here, especially after the Paramount opened. They played the Paramount on the stage. They had better facilities down there for stages in the capital did. Grand had actually the better stage in the capital.
Boyd Countyans could also take pride in their own creative efforts. Before the parks and the theaters, many citizens used and entertained their families with storytelling, with music, and craft making. In the early 1900s, Catlettsburg's river trade began declining as the railroads transported more and more goods, including timber, to markets throughout the land. An era was slowly coming to a close in the Gate City. However, Ashland's industrial progress continued. Turning point arrived when George M. Verity selected Ashland as the site for a new steel processing plant in 1920. Ashland found itself the home of the nation's first successful continuous rolling mill. And from that time on, Armco and Ashland's history have been closely linked. The Roaring Twenties also saw the establishment of the area's other major employer, the Ashland Oil and Refining Company. The location of that refinery brought good news and good jobs to Catlettsburg as well as all of Boyd County. As both companies expanded in later years, so did the local population, with Ashland's reaching nearly 30,000 by 1925. Such expansion brought about another building boom with new schools, new banks, a new railroad passenger station, new library, new hotels, new bridges, and new bus lines, all coming to Boyd County.
The Ohio River, it's always been the lifeblood of Boyd County. But you know, back in 1937, the river went on a rampage and rewrote the record book. I know something about that. It was 6 feet 3 inches in my house. Both Catlettsburg and Ashland were very hard hit. Floodwaters covered most of downtown Ashland and extended at some points as far as Central Avenue.
Finally, the water got so high, my wife, they took her out one of the windows over to one of her sister's house, and I stayed in there the next day, and the National Guards made me get out because they claimed there's so much gasoline on the water coming down Greenup Avenue, and it was deep out in the middle of Greenup Avenue. I'd say it was at least 10 foot deep out in the middle. Very swift current.
I remember it was quite the excitement. The bank on 16th Winchester, where the American Bank is now, they thought they were going to lose the building because the water working inside get into enough of it around the building may fall. So they let the water in the windows, get the same pressure inside as you would have outside. That was a great flood.
Boyd County's industrial base became even more significant during the dark days of World War II, as both Armco and Ashland Oil increased their outputs in response to wartime needs. The late 1900s have also proved to be an equally challenging time for Boyd County. What has always seen Boyd County in times of hardship has been a strength of character, coupled with the determination to do what has to be done, qualities born of a pioneering heritage. Boyd County's founding fathers and mothers developed common sense priorities of hard work, self-reliance. Succeeding generations have attempted to match. Their fierce commitment to their families and to the progress of this area resulted in a proud history which we can all celebrate. The continuation of that commitment brought us from log schoolhouses to multi-million-dollar school systems, from hills to turnpikes, and from farmlands to factories. Many of our Boyd County ancestors made significant contributions to the creation of Catlettsburg and Ashland, and they're worthy of remembrance. Through the years, Boyd County has had its share of good times and bad times, but prospects for the future are really looking up. Working together, we are creating tomorrow's history today. And for Boyd County, this is only the beginning.